What happens when the world's kindest movie star sits across from a talk show legend and suddenly flips the script? Keanu Reeves walked onto Steve Harvey's stage to talk movies, but one look at Steve's crucifix changed everything. Moments later, Steve was in tears, and Keanu whispered something he'd never said in public. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights came up in the studio to the usual burst of applause. The theme music of the Steve Harvey Show played with its familiar rhythm, warm and energetic, setting the tone for another lively segment. The audience was buzzing, their faces lit with excitement as Steve Harvey strolled onto the stage in a sharp gray suit, that unmistakable mustache and confident stride drawing cheers from every corner of the room. Steve grinned wide and waved at the crowd, cracking a joke about the weather and tossing in a little dance move that made the front row erupt in laughter. He held his cue cards in one hand but barely looked down at them. After years on stage, the rhythm of this show lived in his bones. Everything was in place. Everything was moving according to plan. Tonight's guest was someone the audience had been looking forward to. Steve's voice dropped just enough to create a moment of pause. "Now y'all know our next guest," he said, pacing slowly. "You've seen him fight assassins, dodge bullets, travel through time, and somehow still end up as the internet's favorite good guy." The crowd erupted. People stood, clapping, shouting. "Hollywood calls him a legend," Steve said, his voice full of admiration now. "But I call him something better, the realest man in the game." The band gave a playful flourish as Steve lifted his hand toward the side entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Keanu Reeves." The doors opened, and Keanu stepped out to a wave of sound, cheering, applause, a few whistles scattered from the crowd. But true to form, he didn't wave like a movie star. He gave a small, shy smile, nodding with a hand pressed gently to his chest, grateful but humble. He wore dark jeans, a black crew-neck shirt, and a plain navy blazer. No jewelry, no designer flash. His hair hung slightly loose, his eyes scanning the crowd with quiet appreciation. The applause grew louder, but he seemed almost startled by it, bowing his head slightly as he reached Steve and gave him a quick handshake, followed by a brief, sincere hug. Steve beamed. "Man, I've been trying to get you on this show for years." Keanu chuckled softly. "Thank you for having me, Steve. I'm honored to be here." They sat down side by side. The audience settled in, expecting to hear stories about stunt training, on-set mishaps, maybe something about Matrix sunglasses or motorcycles. But then it happened. As Keanu adjusted in his chair, his eyes landed on the small crucifix around Steve's neck, shining faintly against his shirt collar. And in that moment, something imperceptible shifted. The playfulness in Keanu's eyes softened. The smile on his face faded, not in sadness, but in contemplation. He leaned forward just a little and looked at Steve. "Steve," he said quietly, "can I tell you something I've never shared in public before?" Steve paused, and in that pause, everything changed. Steve sat back in his chair, blinking, caught slightly off guard. The audience was still, unsure if what they had just heard was part of the show or the start of something else entirely. The atmosphere hadn't dropped, it had deepened. The lights still shone, the cameras still rolled, but the energy in the room had shifted. Even the crew behind the cameras stopped moving. Keanu didn't look away. His expression wasn't theatrical, it wasn't performative. It was steady, calm. But behind his eyes was a weight that no script could hold. Steve saw it instantly. The kind of expression only a man who had lived through something heavy could wear without saying a word. "I don't want to interrupt the flow," Keanu said, his voice still low, careful. "But I felt something just now, when I saw that cross you wear." Steve instinctively looked down at the silver crucifix hanging at the center of his chest. He had worn it for years. a quiet reminder of his own journey through pain and faith. He nodded once, slowly. "You can tell me anything, man," Steve said, his voice softening. "This is your space." The audience leaned in, still hushed. The cue cards Steve had planned to use sat on the table between them, untouched. Whatever was about to happen, it wasn't part of the scheduled interview. And yet, no one seemed to mind. The anticipation was no longer for punchlines or film clips. It was for something else. Something more human. Keanu looked down for a second, as if collecting a thought he hadn't planned to share. Then he looked up again, and there was no trace of hesitation in his eyes. "I've done a lot of interviews," he said. "Most of them are about characters I've played. But the man sitting here isn't a character." Steve nodded, watching him closely. Keanu continued. "There was a time in my life when I didn't think I'd make it through. I mean that literally. There were days I woke up and wished I hadn't. Nights where I stared at my ceiling for hours, trying to remember what hope even felt like." A few gasps rose faintly from the crowd. Keanu paused to let the silence breathe. "I didn't talk to anyone about it," he said. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think anyone would understand." Steve folded his hands in his lap, his shoulders dropping slightly. He knew pain. He recognized that tone. But he said nothing. He knew to let silence do its work. Keanu exhaled softly. Then, one night, everything changed. And the strange thing is, it changed because of you. Steve's eyes lifted slowly. Keanu looked directly at him, his voice a whisper now. "You were the first voice that reached me when everything else went quiet." Steve didn't speak. He simply sat there, holding Keanu's gaze, feeling the weight of the moment begin to take root. The audience, too, had stopped shifting in their seats. Phones stayed lowered. Nobody wanted to break the spell. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was testimony. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on his knees. His hands stayed clasped, almost prayerfully, as if the words he was about to say needed a foundation. "I was scrolling through my phone," he began again. "It was late. I hadn't slept in days. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be. I was just trying to survive the night." Steve's lips parted slightly, his brow furrowed with concern. "I wasn't searching for anything in particular," Keanu said. "Just noise, something to drown out the thoughts, something to distract me from myself." He paused, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "And that's when I came across a video of you." Steve tilted his head slightly, surprised but silent. "You were on stage," Keanu continued, "talking about storms, about how God doesn't waste pain, about how sometimes the thing that's breaking you is actually breaking you open." The memory seemed to steady him, like revisiting a light in a dark hallway. "I don't know why I stopped scrolling. Maybe it was the way you said it. Maybe it was the way the cross around your neck caught the light. But I watched the whole thing. Then, I watched it again. And again." His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. He said, "If you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet." And something in that line, I don't know. It didn't fix everything, but it reached me. He finally looked up again, directly at Steve, who hadn't moved an inch. For the first time in weeks, I got out of bed the next morning. The crowd was silent. Even the studio lights seemed to hum softer. "I've never told anyone that," Keanu said, his tone full of reverence, "but I've carried your words with me ever since." Steve blinked, his hand moving instinctively to the cross around his neck. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Keanu nodded gently, understanding. "I didn't come here today to talk about movies. I came here because something told me it was time to tell you the truth." The lights above seemed warmer now, the stage smaller, as if the entire world had narrowed to just the space between these two men. Steve finally found his voice, though it came out rough. "You don't know what that means to me." Keanu sat back slowly. I think I do, because that night you didn't just speak. You rescued me. The show had begun like any other, but it would never be the same again. Steve set the cue cards down without a word. He didn't slide them aside, he didn't tuck them away. He placed them down gently in front of him, palms open, as if surrendering the show itself to something greater. He glanced at the producers off stage. No one moved to interrupt. The moment belonged to something deeper now. Say what you need to say, Steve said quietly, almost reverently. Keanu nodded. His voice didn't rise, didn't fall into dramatic cadence. It simply existed, steady, reflective. Thank you, he said, for giving me space to say it. Steve leaned back, resting one ankle over his knee, hands clasped in front of him. Go on. Keanu took a breath and started from the center of himself. I think people look at someone like me and assume I have it all figured out. Because of the movies, because of the red carpets, because I've been lucky enough to be seen. He paused, not for effect, but for honesty. But the truth is, I'm just a man who's been through things. Steve nodded, slowly, recognizing the weight behind those words. He didn't fill the space with humor. He didn't change the subject. He just listened. Keanu continued, his eyes drifting slightly as he spoke. I've lost people I love. I've lost parts of myself. I've questioned why I'm still here when others aren't. And through all of it, I've come to realize something I never expected. He looked directly at Steve again. Kindness is survival. Steve leaned in slightly, brows drawn in. Most people think kindness is some grand gesture, something to do when cameras are rolling or when it's convenient. But I learned early on that it's the only thing that ever kept me human. Keanu gave a small smile, but it was heavy with memory. When I give up my seat on the subway, when I help a crew member carry cables across a cold set, when I give part of my paycheck to the stunt team, it's not about being nice. It's not about generosity. He paused, his voice dipping even softer. It's about not letting the world make me numb. Steve nodded again, this time slower, as if the words had landed somewhere familiar. I don't think people realize what kind of strength that takes, he said. Keanu's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Kindness isn't weakness, he said. It's a decision. Every single day. The audience sat with that, unmoving. Not one person shifted in their chair. And when you've lived through silence, Keanu added, when you've walked through grief so thick you forget the color of the sky, just holding a door for someone can feel like a declaration of war against despair. Steve looked at him with eyes wide, not in surprise, but in understanding. Then he said something simple, something that only someone who had known his own darkness would recognize in another. You carry silence like it's familiar. Keanu didn't respond right away. He just held Steve's gaze, letting the truth of that sentence rest between them. The way Steve said it, it wasn't a question. It wasn't even an observation. It was a knowing. Like one man looking at another and seeing behind the skin, past the surface, into the part most people never show. After a moment, Keanu nodded once. I do, he said softly. Silence has followed me for most of my life. Not in a loud way, not even in a way that most people would notice. But it's there, in the background, like a song you can't quite forget. Steve leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. What kind of silence? Keanu looked down, his fingers intertwined in his lap. The kind that shows up when the phone stops ringing, when the door doesn't open, when birthdays come and go and the person you're waiting for never walks through. His voice caught slightly, but he didn't stop. I've had a lot of that silence. When my father left, when my daughter was stillborn, when Jennifer passed just weeks later, when my sister was in pain. It gets into your bones after a while. The studio remained completely still. Not a single sound interrupted the moment. Keanu continued, I used to think silence was emptiness, that it meant no one was listening, that maybe I didn't matter. But now, he looked up, his voice steadier than before. Now I understand that silence can be sacred, not because it's quiet, but because it's honest. Steve exhaled, slowly. Yeah, he whispered. I know that silence too. Keanu nodded. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't demand anything. It just stays with you until you're ready to hear what it's been trying to say. Steve swallowed hard, visibly moved. And what has yours said? Keanu took a breath before answering. That the pain I carry doesn't make me broken. It makes me responsible. Steve tilted his head, puzzled. Responsible for what? He asked. Keanu's eyes softened. For making sure that the pain I've known doesn't get passed on to someone else. The audience shifted subtly now, not from restlessness, but from being stirred. People were absorbing every word, every beat of breath, every confession. Steve looked at Keanu with a seriousness that only someone who's lived their own testimony could give. Man, he said, voice thick, that's not acting, that's ministry. Keanu gave a faint smile. I'm not here to preach, he said. I don't have a pulpit, but I know what it means to survive something you thought would destroy you. And sometimes, the only thing that makes survival bearable is reaching back to pull someone else forward. Steve sat quietly for a moment, then said with complete sincerity, You don't need a pulpit to change someone's life. Keanu looked at Steve, his eyes steady but vulnerable. I never wanted to be known for tragedy, he said. I just wanted to live with purpose. And sometimes, that purpose shows up in the smallest acts. He paused, folding his hands together again. When people talk about the subway stories or how I paid part of my salary to crew members or stuntmen, it always surprises me, because to me those weren't extraordinary choices. They were necessary ones. Steve nodded. Because you saw something in them? Keanu shook his head gently. Because I saw something in myself. He leaned forward, voice calm, reflective. I know what it's like to be the one holding the boom mic, freezing at 2 a.m. I know what it's like to feel invisible while someone else shines. And I know what it's like to wonder if your work, your existence, even matters. He sat back slowly, letting that linger. That's why I help. That's why I give. Not to be noble, but because I remember what it felt like to need someone and not know who to ask. Steve looked down at his hands, then back up at Keanu. There's something different about the way you talk, he said. You don't perform your words, you carry them. Keanu smiled slightly. I don't know how to perform grief or hope. I just know how to live through it. The audience stirred again, quiet murmurs from people who weren't just watching, they were experiencing something too. Steve rested his hand over the crucifix once more, fingers gently tracing its edges. It takes courage to speak this way, especially on a stage. Keanu glanced around, his gaze falling briefly on the cameras, the lights, the rows of people watching. I'm not thinking about the stage right now, he said. I'm thinking about the people who might be watching this later, alone, at night, maybe on a phone, maybe like I was, hoping something will reach them. Steve didn't speak. His throat worked as he swallowed, overcome. You reached me, Keanu added, and if I can reach someone else, even one person, then everything I've lived through starts to make sense. Steve leaned back, visibly overwhelmed but still holding steady. The studio, once built for applause and laughter, now felt like something entirely different. It felt like a sanctuary. You're not just surviving, Steve finally said. You're healing people, whether you realize it or not. Keanu looked at him, voice quiet and full of peace. Then maybe I'm finally doing something right. And with that, the cue cards stayed on the table. The cameras stayed rolling. But the show was no longer a show. It had become a conversation between two men who knew pain, who had walked through fire, and somehow found the courage to speak life anyway. And the world, watching in silence, leaned in to listen. Steve sat with Keanu's words still echoing in the air, but it was the silence that followed that carried the most weight. A pause long enough to be felt, but not uncomfortable, just real. Like a sacred moment had taken shape between them, and no one dared to disturb it. Steve's voice came soft but steady. "You said silence has been with you for a long time." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes down for a moment before lifting again. "It has," he said. "Silence is where I've heard the clearest things." Steve tilted his head slightly. "What kind of things?" Keanu exhaled slowly, eyes clouding with memory. "Truth, pain, God, myself, sometimes all at once." He paused, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I remember when my sister Kim was first diagnosed with leukemia. We were young, too young to understand what life and death really meant. But watching her go through it, day after day, the chemotherapy, the fatigue, the hair loss, the hospital smell, something in me changed." The audience was silent. No rustling, no coughs, just stillness. "She didn't complain," Keanu continued. "She never made it about her. Even when she was in pain, she'd smile. She'd ask how I was doing. She taught me that love can exist in suffering." He looked toward Steve, his voice soft. "And in those long hospital nights, when there was nothing but the sound of machines beeping and IV drips ticking, I realized silence isn't empty. It's where the soul speaks." Steve swallowed hard, his hand gently brushing over the cross on his chest. Keanu went on. "Later, when my father walked out of our lives, I didn't have words for that pain either. I was still just a kid. I remember waiting by the window some nights, hoping he'd show up, hoping he'd knock or call or just explain why." He shook his head gently, not bitterly, just with the quiet acceptance of someone who had carried that weight for a long time. But he never came. And eventually, the silence stopped feeling like waiting. It just became the background music of my life. Steve looked down, pressing his palm flat against the crucifix. His fingers didn't move this time. They simply rested there. Keanu drew in another breath, this time deeper. "But nothing prepared me for Jennifer. And our daughter." He stopped. A long pause stretched, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the memory itself required room. "She was due in a few weeks," he said quietly. "We had the nursery ready, the name picked, the dreams written. Tadia Green." He looked away for a second, his throat tightening. "But she was stillborn." The audience gasped softly. Even those who knew his story felt it differently, hearing it from his own mouth. "And just weeks later," he continued, "Jennifer died in a car accident." Steve's face dropped, eyes blinking slowly as emotion overtook him. Steve didn't speak. He couldn't. His hand stayed pressed to his chest, fingers gently holding the crucifix, as if it were the only thing grounding him in that moment. His eyes shimmered, blinking more often now, not from stage lights, but from everything he was hearing. Keanu sat still, his voice now quieter but even more certain. "After Jennifer died, I would sit in the living room at night, staring at the door, knowing it wouldn't open. I would wake up and forget, just for a second, that she was gone, and then it would hit again. The kind of grief that doesn't even scream, it just hollows." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "I stopped going out. I didn't answer calls. I didn't read scripts. I didn't care about work. For a while, I didn't care about anything." His eyes flicked upward, glassy but not broken, and the world just kept going. He smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile that comes from scars, not joy. People talk about tragedy like it's a moment, but it's not. It's a presence. It follows you. It eats your appetite. It quiets your laugh. It changes how sunlight feels. Steve's shoulders were tight now, his head slightly bowed. I used to think grief would destroy me, Keanu said, that it would close off everything inside. But then I started to notice something. He looked at Steve again. Every kind act felt bigger. Steve's brow lifted slowly, his expression filled with both awe and pain. The woman who smiled at me in the grocery store when I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. The man who held a door for me when I was too tired to even say thank you. A stranger who nodded as I passed by, like I was still part of the world. Keanu's voice held stillness and gravity all at once. When you've lost everything, every act of kindness becomes sacred. Steve drew in a shaky breath, blinking as his eyes turned red with tears. That's when I realized, Keanu said, it wasn't about big gestures. It was about being human. That's all I had left to give. He paused again, his voice now almost inaudible. And somehow, giving that brought me back. The crowd was still silent. A few sniffles echoed faintly, but no one moved to wipe their eyes. They were holding the moment with him, not just watching it. Steve looked at Keanu with such depth that the cameras couldn't capture it. Only the people in that room would ever truly understand the weight of what was unfolding. He lifted the crucifix slightly, holding it between two fingers, then pressed it back to his chest. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "You don't even realize," Steve said softly. "You're teaching people how to grieve and how to love again after it." Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands resting in his lap, like they still remembered what it felt like to hold someone who was no longer there. The light above them seemed to dim just slightly, or maybe it was just the weight in the room that made everything feel quieter, slower, more sacred. "I didn't plan to talk about this," he said. "I didn't come here thinking I'd revisit those moments. But something about being here, sitting across from you. I don't know, Steve. I think it's time." Steve gave the faintest nod, his own voice too fragile to push forward. He was still holding on to the crucifix like a lifeline, his thumb now gently rubbing over the edges. Keanu leaned forward again, his voice like the echo of a memory. "There's this moment that stayed with me. After Jennifer's funeral, I went home alone. Everyone else had left. The flowers were still there. The sympathy cards stacked neatly on the kitchen counter. The couch was empty, her book still open on the armrest. And I sat on the floor. No lights, no music, just me and the silence." He looked up again, eyes glassy but steady. And in that silence, I heard everything. Every regret, every question, every apology I never got to say, every future we never got to live. He took a breath, one that seemed to come from deeper than his lungs. But I also heard something else. Not a voice, not words, just a presence. Steve blinked slowly, lips slightly parted. "I didn't know what to call it then," Keanu said. "I just knew I wasn't alone." He paused, and this time it was Steve who filled the silence. Not with words, but with his eyes. They were misted, wide, and filled with something beyond understanding. Maybe compassion, maybe recognition. "That was the moment I realized grief doesn't just break you," Keanu said. "It opens something. It stretches you beyond who you thought you were. And if you let it, if you let the silence do its work, it doesn't leave you empty. It leaves you deeper." He turned toward the audience, though he wasn't performing. "I know someone here is carrying something. I don't know your name, I don't know your pain, but I do know this, whatever it is, you're not the only one in the silence." A soft exhale came from the back of the studio, a sniffle from the front row. Steve, still holding the cross, whispered so softly it barely reached the mic. "I felt that." Keanu looked back at him. "I know." Steve's voice cracked just enough to break the air. "Then maybe that silence wasn't meant to crush us. Maybe it was meant to call us. Keanu nodded once, slowly. And maybe this, he said, this right here, is our answer. Keanu's eyes lowered again, and the entire room instinctively leaned closer. Even without words, something in his posture signaled a shift. The conversation had already become deeply personal, but now it was crossing a threshold. He wasn't just reflecting anymore, he was remembering something he had never shared in public, something that once lived in the dark corners of his silence. There was a night, he began slowly, when I didn't want to be alive anymore. Steve froze. The studio seemed to hold its breath all at once. I didn't want to die exactly, Keanu continued, but I couldn't see a reason to keep going. I couldn't find one. His voice had lowered, more than before, not for dramatic effect, but because the memory itself seemed to dim the volume of everything around it. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I'd stopped answering calls. I didn't even remember what day it was. He ran his hand across his face, pausing for a moment. Not for control, but for honesty. I'd wake up and stay in bed, sometimes for hours, sometimes the entire day. And it wasn't sadness exactly. It was emptiness. Like someone had drained the meaning out of everything and just left the shell of me behind. Steve watched him with complete stillness, his eyes wide but full of something gentle. There was no urgency to speak, just a quiet reverence for what was being shared. I couldn't cry, Keanu added. I wanted to, but the tears just wouldn't come. It's strange how you can feel so much and yet feel nothing at the same time. He looked down at the floor, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. And I remember lying in bed one night, the lights off, the window open. I hadn't slept in what felt like days. My body felt heavy, like I was wearing grief-like armor. The room was silent. No one moved. Even the faint buzz of studio equipment seemed to quiet. Keanu inhaled deeply. I didn't pray. I didn't journal. I didn't reach for help. I just laid there, for hours, just staring at the ceiling. He blinked slowly, as though recalling the feel of the night air on his skin, the texture of the blankets, the echo of his own breath in that room. Eventually, he said, I reached for my phone. Not because I was expecting anything, just because I needed the distraction. Something, anything. Steve shifted, just slightly, the anticipation building as he listened. I opened one of those video apps, Keanu continued. I wasn't even really watching, I was just scrolling, letting random clips flash by. I was too numb to care. He paused, his voice became nearly a whisper. And then, there you were. Steve blinked. A moment of visible shock washed across his face, but he didn't speak. Keanu's eyes met his, and what came next was the beginning of everything neither man could have foreseen. I didn't recognize the clip at first, Keanu said, his voice low and reverent. It wasn't one of your comedy bits. It wasn't from your show. It looked like a moment between things, like something someone recorded after the cameras stopped rolling. Steve's brows furrowed slightly, clearly trying to remember. You were standing on a small stage, Keanu continued. You had a mic in one hand and the other hand was over your chest, right over that cross you're wearing right now. Steve instinctively touched the crucifix again, glancing down at it, as if trying to see it through Keanu's eyes. You were talking about storms, Keanu said. But not weather. Life. About how some storms don't come to destroy us, they come to clear the path. Murmur passed softly through the audience. Barely a sound. More a collective inhale. I remember you said, sometimes the pain isn't punishment, it's preparation. Steve blinked slowly. The line hit him like a wave. He hadn't thought about that moment in years. Keanu's voice didn't break. It stayed steady. But there was something raw beneath the surface. Something sacred. I don't know why I stopped scrolling. I'd passed so many videos without even thinking. But when you said that line, I froze. He paused and glanced around the room, then returned his focus to Steve. I watched the whole thing, all the way through. It was only a few minutes, but it felt like you were talking directly to me. Not to a crowd, not to a camera, just to me. Steve leaned back slightly, visibly shaken, his hand still clinging to the cross. And then I watched it again, Keanu said. And again. His voice dropped further, a hush in every syllable. You said something else I never forgot. You said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. Steve's lips parted just slightly, his eyes shimmered. Keanu took a slow breath. I hadn't thought about God in a long time. I hadn't thought about hope. But that night, something in the way you said those words, it reached past the numbness. He looked directly at Steve now. You weren't trying to save anyone. You were just being yourself. But in that moment, your honesty became a lifeline. The audience sat completely still. Even those unfamiliar with the original clip were now living it through Keanu's eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he said, I sat up. I put my feet on the floor. I didn't move right away, but I moved enough. Enough to know I was still here. Steve swallowed, hard, his fingers clenched around the crucifix. Keanu's voice was now no louder than a whisper. That clip didn't save my life, but it gave me a reason to keep holding on until something else did. Steve's hands were trembling now, just slightly. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't speak, didn't blink away the tears welling up in his eyes. He simply listened, fully present, as if his soul had leaned forward. Keanu looked at him with something deeper than gratitude. It was reverence. It was the look of a man who had touched the bottom and somehow found air again. I've done hundreds of interviews, Keanu said, and never once have I told that story. Not in full, not out loud. Steve finally whispered, Why now? Keanu didn't hesitate. Because when I walked out here and saw that cross hanging from your neck, it was like time folded, like I was right back in that moment again. And I realized I never got to tell you what your words did for me. Steve lowered his gaze, staring at the cross resting on his chest. He touched it again, this time with both hands, holding it like a memory. You weren't preaching, Keanu said. You weren't trying to be anyone but yourself. That's what made it powerful. That's what made it real. The crowd remained in absolute silence. Not even a chair creaked. You carried your pain, Keanu continued, and you turned it into something that could lift others. You turned your storms into shelter. And that night, I found shelter in your voice. Steve exhaled, a long breath that sounded like it had been waiting years to be released. I didn't know anyone was listening, Steve said softly. Keanu gave a faint, knowing smile. And that's what makes it holy? Steve looked up, blinking back tears. I was just speaking from my own pain, he said. I was going through something myself that night. I didn't think it would even matter. Keanu leaned in. It mattered. It mattered more than you'll ever know. For a moment, neither man spoke. And no one in the audience dared to interrupt. It wasn't performance anymore. It was something sacred, unfolding in real time. I remember exactly how I felt that night, Keanu added. Like I was hanging by a thread, like I was disappearing inch by inch. But your words pulled me back. He nodded once, slowly. You said God doesn't waste pain, and that line, it planted something in me. Not a full hope, just a seed. Steve covered his mouth with one hand, his shoulders trembling just slightly. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu said, I believed. Maybe I wasn't forgotten. The moment was thick with emotion, like the air itself had weight. And I needed you to know that, Keanu whispered, because you've probably forgotten the power of your own voice. Steve looked at him, fully undone, and said the only thing his heart could manage in that moment. Thank you. Keanu's voice remained quiet, but there was a steady strength behind it now. Not loud, not theatrical, just sure. as if every word was something he had waited years to release. "I don't know who filmed the clip," he said. "I don't know if it was ever meant to be shared, but someone caught it, and whoever uploaded it, they'll never know what they did." Steve nodded slowly, still visibly moved, still holding onto the crucifix, as if it now meant more than it ever had before. "It looked like one of those in-between moments," Keanu continued, "not a full production. You were standing on a small stage, the lighting wasn't perfect, the mic had a slight echo, but none of that mattered." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, speaking now with a quiet intensity. "Because what you were saying, it wasn't just words. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished. It was something you'd lived through. And that's what made it hit." Steve listened closely, his lips pressed together, his eyes never leaving Keanu. "You were talking about storms," Keanu said. "Not weather, but life. About how some storms don't show up to destroy us. Some come to reveal what needed to be rebuilt." Steve blinked. That line had come from a moment of his own pain. One night after a show, in the middle of a personal storm he hadn't shared with anyone. He'd spoken freely, unfiltered, and now, hearing it back from someone else, it was like reading his own soul out loud. "You said God doesn't waste pain," Keanu continued. "That the things breaking us open might be the very things setting us free." He paused. I'd never heard faith framed like that before. It didn't sound like religion, it sounded like truth. The studio was still. No cameras moved. No one reached for their phones. Every person in the room was locked into the moment, drawn into the sacred space between confession and healing. "You wore this," Keanu added, motioning gently to the cross on Steve's chest. "That night, it caught the light, and I remember, I didn't even hear what you were saying at first. I just saw that crucifix, and for some reason, I couldn't look away." Steve touched it again, almost reflexively. "And then I listened," Keanu said, "to your voice, to your pain, to your hope." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "That moment became my lifeline." Steve covered his mouth again, trying to steady his breath. "I watched that video 3 times, Keanu said. "Not because I was looking for answers, but because it was the first thing in days that didn't feel empty." He looked down for a second, then back up at Steve. "And the next morning, for the first time in a long time, I got out of bed." Steve's throat tightened. He couldn't look away. His face held a mix of disbelief and emotion, but it was clear this moment was changing him. "I didn't even know I needed that video until I saw it," Keanu said. "It didn't preach to me. It didn't try to fix me. It just sat there beside me in the dark, like a friend who wasn't afraid of my silence." The audience was still leaning in, caught between reverence and awe. They weren't witnessing a performance. They were witnessing something sacred being passed between 2 souls. "You talked about pain like it wasn't shameful," Keanu continued, "like it wasn't something to hide. You said it was the very thing God could use." Steve closed his eyes briefly. He remembered saying that. He had almost deleted the clip after it was recorded. It didn't feel polished enough. It didn't feel good enough. But he had uploaded it anyway, raw and unfiltered. And now, years later, here it was, saving someone. He said, "The broken pieces of your story might be the strongest part of someone else's foundation," Keanu recalled. And I thought, what if that's true? What if everything I've lost isn't just loss? He took a breath, eyes shimmering. "Okay after that night? I didn't suddenly become okay after that night. I didn't have a breakthrough or a miracle. But I moved. I got up. I made coffee. I stood under the shower. I breathed." Steve nodded slowly, lips parted, unable to look away. "Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't healing," Keanu said. "It's moving forward when nothing around you has changed." The weight of his words settled over the audience like a blanket. People were crying now, not loudly, quietly, openly, freely. Steve's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know you saw that video. Keanu gave the smallest smile. You didn't have to know. That's what made it real. He sat back slightly, letting Steve absorb the moment. You weren't trying to be anyone, Keanu said. You weren't trying to go viral or say the perfect thing. You were just standing there in your truth. And somehow, your truth gave me permission to stay alive. Steve looked down again at the crucifix, but this time, his hand trembled. I've told that story about storms to 1,000 people, he said, but I never imagined it would reach you. Keanu nodded. It did, and I needed you to know. He paused, his voice dropping again. You didn't know it, but you saved me. Steve's breath caught in his throat. You saved me, Keanu repeated, slower this time. And I think it's time you heard that from someone who lived because of you. Steve's eyes filled again, not with surprise this time, but with understanding. Deep, sacred understanding. His shoulders dropped, as if the weight of all the years he had poured out his heart finally landed in his own hands, returned to him in the form of someone else's healing. Keanu let the silence breathe. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't looking for applause. He just wanted to honor the truth. I carried your words with me, he said, day after day, not because they fixed me, but because they reminded me I wasn't invisible. Steve let out a breath that trembled at the end. You said something else in that clip, Keanu added. I've never forgotten it. You said, purpose doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through your pain. Steve's head dropped slightly. He whispered, I remember that. Keanu leaned forward again. Those words gave me permission to stop pretending I was okay. They gave me space to just feel what I was feeling without shame. He paused. After that night, I didn't go back to acting right away. I didn't call my agent. I didn't try to force myself back into the world. I just started moving, inch by inch. And every time I thought I couldn't keep going, I'd replay your voice. Steve finally looked up again, tears in his eyes. You're telling me I was a lifeline for you, he said. Keanu nodded. That night, yes, you were. He looked around the room and then back at Steve. And I think there are a lot of people in this world who have no idea how far their words travel. They speak from their scars, and those words become bridges for others. The audience was silent again, letting every word settle. You stood on that stage with a microphone, Keanu continued. But what you really held was something sacred, something eternal. And you didn't even know it. Steve covered his mouth with his hand, overwhelmed. That's why I came here, Keanu said. Not to promote a movie, not to talk about roles, but to tell you, face to face, that your pain gave me permission to survive mine. He looked back at Steve, locking eyes. You were a stranger to me, but in that moment, you became a lighthouse. Steve didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at Keanu, then at the floor, then at the crucifix in his hands. Finally, he whispered, I was just trying to survive too. Keanu nodded. That's the beauty of it, he said. You were surviving. And in doing that, you were saving people you couldn't even see. Steve closed his eyes, and a tear finally fell. Not one of sorrow, but of release. You matter, Steve, Keanu said gently. Not because of your name, not because of your fame, but because in your most human moment, you gave someone else a reason to keep breathing. Steve's hand stayed pressed over his chest, fingers clutching the crucifix like it was the only thing keeping him steady. His shoulders rose with a slow, deep breath, but his face was still caught between awe and emotion. His voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a whisper. I just talked from the heart, he said, his throat tight. That night, I wasn't trying to preach. I didn't have a plan. I was hurting too. I was just speaking. Keanu nodded with a gentle stillness in his expression, his voice low but full of weight. That's what made it real. Steve looked up. You weren't performing, Keanu said softly. You were ministering. The words landed with quiet force. Steve's eyes widened just slightly, and his hand gripped the cross tighter. He didn't respond right away. He seemed to be absorbing the moment, like a wave he hadn't expected to crash over him. "I've watched a lot of speeches," Keanu continued. "Seen a lot of people speak with charisma, polish, conviction. But what I saw in that clip wasn't charisma. It wasn't polish. It was faith. It was pain. And it was truth." Steve's lips parted as if to reply, but no words came. Keanu leaned forward, eyes locked onto his. "You think you're a comedian with faith," he said, "but you're something more." Steve blinked. "You're a minister in disguise." The audience didn't react. No gasp, no applause, just silence. But it wasn't hollow. It was sacred. The kind of silence that settles over a room when something eternal is said out loud. Steve lowered his head. The muscles in his jaw tightened. His free hand curled slowly into a fist in his lap. "I'm not a minister," he said under his breath, shaking his head slightly. "I tell jokes for a living. I try to make people laugh through their pain. That's all." Keanu didn't move. He waited for Steve to look up again. "You do make people laugh," he said. "But what you don't realize is that your laughter has always carried something heavier. You don't laugh to distract. You laugh to connect. You laugh to lift." Steve swallowed hard. Keanu's voice softened even more. "God uses all kinds of messengers," he said. "Some stand in pulpits, some sing in choirs, and some wear a suit, hold a mic, and speak from a place so honest that the people listening feel seen for the first time in years." Steve's head tilted slightly, eyes watering again. "Man, I never thought of it that way." Keanu nodded. "I know. That's why I had to say it." The room was quiet, still, not a sound from the audience. Even the lights seemed to feel the weight of what had just been spoken. Two men sat on a stage meant for entertainment, but what they were giving the world now was ministry in motion. Steve leaned back in his chair slightly, wiping beneath his eyes with the edge of his finger. He took a breath, but even that sounded full. His voice returned in fragments. "All these years," he said, "I've wondered if it mattered. The things I said when nobody was watching, the things I shared when I was too tired to be funny." Keanu's eyes softened. "It did matter, more than you know." Steve looked toward the audience for a brief second, then back at Keanu. "There were nights I thought about quitting. I mean, not just walking away from TV, I mean disappearing, for good. I thought, maybe I've already said everything I'm supposed to say." He chuckled dryly through the emotion, his voice cracking. "Never occurred to me that somebody like you would be sitting in a dark room one night, hearing one of those moments and finding life again through it." Keanu nodded slowly, his tone reverent. "That's how God works sometimes, quietly, through someone who thinks they're just surviving." Steve shook his head gently. "I thought I was just venting, just trying to remind myself to keep going." Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady and warm. "And you reminded me too." He let that sit, then added softly, "You reminded me that I wasn't alone, that even if the world felt cold, there were still voices worth listening to, still light coming through, even if it came through the cracks." Steve closed his eyes for a moment, nodding, barely able to hold himself together. "I didn't go to seminary," he said. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd be someone people came to for hope." Keanu smiled faintly, respectfully. "That's what makes you dangerous." "In the best way?" "You're not trying to be anything. You just are. And that's what reaches people." Steve looked down again, staring at the crucifix in his palm. "My mama gave me this cross when I was 20, he said. She told me, don't wear it for fashion, wear it for protection. Wear it because the world won't always understand you." Keanu nodded slowly. She was right. Steve let out a breath, half laugh, half tear. She always was. Keanu looked directly at him, his voice now gentler than it had been all night. "You've been carrying this faith for decades, Steve. Maybe you didn't know it, but every time you shared your pain, every time you talked about storms, about God not wasting hurt, you were preaching. Steve shook his head lightly, still not fully able to accept it. I never thought of it as preaching. I just spoke when my heart was breaking. Keanu smiled, and that's exactly what preaching sounds like. Steve's hands tightened around the cross, this time not to hold it, but to honor it. And the studio, filled with lights and cameras and an audience expecting laughter, sat under a blanket of sacred silence. Steve looked across at Keanu, his voice low and fragile. All this time, he said, I'd thought my pain was the part of me I had to hide. I'd joke through it, talk around it, laugh loud enough to keep people from asking questions. Keanu nodded slowly. Me too. Steve met his eyes, searching. You too? Keanu's answer was calm. Grief doesn't care who you are, Steve. And it doesn't ask permission. It just shows up and teaches you how to live differently. Steve took that in for a moment. Then he said quietly, but I never thought I was someone God would use. Keanu leaned forward, his tone sacred now, as if speaking into a space beyond just Steve. That's exactly why he used you. Steve blinked. Because you weren't trying to be a hero, you were trying to survive. And that's the voice people listen to, not because it's loud, but because it's real. Steve let the words wash over him. Keanu continued, I've seen a lot of stages. I've stood on red carpets. I've played roles where people cheered when I spoke. But nothing has moved me like hearing your voice that night when you didn't even know anyone was listening. He let a long pause fill the air. You weren't entertaining, you were testifying. Steve stared at him, stunned. Keanu nodded gently. And that night, sitting in the dark, I realized something. I didn't need a sermon. I didn't need a rescue. I needed a voice that felt like mine. A voice that had been through the fire and still chose to speak light. Steve whispered, I didn't even know what I was saying that night. But your soul did, Keanu replied. That's where the power came from. He sat back, giving Steve space to breathe. I think we forget, Keanu said, that sometimes the most sacred words are the ones we say when we're breaking. Steve's head dropped again, his fingers tightening once more around the cross. I never felt qualified to speak on God, Steve said. I mess up, I fall short, I doubt, and yet somehow... He stopped, overcome again. Keanu finished the sentence for him. Somehow, God still uses you. Steve exhaled hard, like his soul had just released something it had held onto for years. You're not a preacher, Steve, Keanu said, and that's why you're able to reach the people that preachers sometimes can't. Steve laughed once through the tears. That sounds backwards. Keanu smiled softly. God doesn't work in straight lines. The studio was still. There was no rush to move on. The audience knew instinctively that they were witnessing something eternal. And Steve, for the first time in his long career, didn't feel like the one holding the mic. He felt like the one finally being spoken to. Keanu sat forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed slightly. The lights around him didn't seem bright anymore. The crowd didn't seem present. All that existed in that moment was the space between him and Steve. A kind of stillness had wrapped itself around the stage, like a quiet shield. Then Keanu looked up, slowly. There's something, he said, I've never said out loud. Steve didn't respond. He just watched him, his body still, his heart already leaning in. Keanu's voice dropped lower. I need to say it to you. A tear slid down Steve's cheek. He didn't brush it away. He just nodded. Once. Keanu stared at the floor for a second, then lifted his eyes and met Steve's again. I've spent most of my life playing characters, he said. Roles with lines, stories with structure. I learned how to become other people so well, I started forgetting how to be myself. He swallowed. His voice stayed steady, but it carried weight. People think being famous means you're surrounded all the time, that you never feel alone, but I've never felt more invisible than I have in rooms full of people who only see the screen version of me. He paused. Fame doesn't protect you from loneliness, it just hides it better. Steve's lips parted, but again, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. I got used to people clapping for someone who wasn't real, Keanu said. And after a while, it got harder and harder to remember if I mattered when the cameras weren't rolling. The audience sat frozen, absorbing every word. Then one night, Keanu continued, you looked into a camera and spoke words that had no makeup, no costume, no edits. You just told the truth. His hands were clasped together now, held tightly. And in that truth, he said, I found a piece of myself I'd forgotten was still there. Steve's eyes were red now, his lips trembling. He had long since given up trying to hide it. You gave me hope, Keanu said, without ever knowing my name, without asking for anything, without even trying. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice cracked just slightly. You reminded me that I mattered. The sentence landed like a soft explosion. Not loud, but deep. It spread across the room like warmth, like light touching every dark corner. Steve's chest rose sharply, then dropped in a shaky exhale. His shoulders trembled as he looked down again, overwhelmed. Keanu leaned back slightly, as if releasing a burden he'd carried too long. I never told anyone that, he said. Not my closest friends, not the people who think they know me best. He looked at Steve again. But I had to tell you. Steve nodded again, this time slower. His voice caught in his throat, but he whispered the only word that felt right. Thank you. Keanu looked at Steve with eyes that had seen loss, worn grief like a second skin, and still found something to give. His voice was softer now, not from weakness, but from reverence. I think sometimes people don't understand what it means to live after something breaks you, he said. You go through the motions, you smile when people expect you to, you nod through interviews, you thank the crowd. But inside, you're just trying to remember who you were before everything fell apart. Steve wiped at his eyes slowly, his hand trembling slightly. His lips pressed together like he was trying to hold back everything at once. Keanu didn't rush. His words came slow, thoughtful. There were days I didn't feel real, like I was drifting through life, playing a part that used to fit but no longer made sense. And it's hard to say that out loud when everyone around you assumes you're fine. He looked toward the audience for a brief second, then returned to Steve. You didn't know me. You weren't talking to me. But when I saw that video, I felt seen for the first time in a long time. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, both hands now clasped over the cross on his chest. I thought I was invisible, Keanu said. And then your voice reached into that silence and gave me something I didn't know I needed, permission to still exist. A quiet sob escaped from somewhere in the audience. No one turned to look. Everyone was locked in, completely present. 2. 1. You reminded me, Keanu said, that maybe I wasn't forgotten, that maybe there was still purpose in the pieces of my life I thought were useless. Steve finally found his voice again. It came low and shaken. Keanu, he said, I was in a dark place too when I gave that talk. I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't even want to post it. Keanu nodded slowly. That's the thing about truth. You don't have to decorate it. It travels. It finds the people it's meant for, even if you never know it. Steve closed his eyes for a long moment. His chest rose and fell heavily. I didn't know it would find you, he whispered. But it did, Keanu said, and it carried me. He looked down at his own hands now. For a while, I lived in shadows. Behind cameras, behind characters, behind pain. But your voice reached into that shadow and called something back into the light. Steve sat with that, breath caught between disbelief and understanding. "You didn't try to save me," Keanu added. "You just told the truth. And that truth gave me space to keep going." He looked up again directly at Steve, and I'll never forget it. Steve pressed the crucifix to his lips for a brief second, his face trembling. Keanu saw Steve struggling to find words, and he didn't press him. He just sat in the stillness with him. Sometimes the most powerful part of a conversation isn't what's said. It's what's allowed to breathe between two people when the soul speaks louder than the voice. "I didn't think I mattered anymore," Keanu said, his tone soft but clear. "I didn't think anyone saw the real me. The me behind the interviews, the man who still hurt, who still missed his child, who still talked to someone he lost, hoping the universe was kind enough to let them hear it." Steve covered his mouth again, his other hand still locked around the crucifix. His shoulders rose and fell with every quiet, heavy breath. "And then you said," Keanu continued, "God doesn't always call the ones who stand tall. Sometimes he calls the ones still learning how to stand." Steve let out a soft, broken sound, almost a laugh, almost a cry. "I forgot I said that," he whispered. "But I didn't," Keanu replied. He shifted slightly in his chair and added with a tender smile, "I clung to that line like a raft in the middle of a storm." The audience was weeping now, softly, without shame. "You reminded me," Keanu said, "that there's strength in just showing up, in just breathing, in just being willing to face another day, when yesterday almost took you out." He looked back toward Steve, and his voice almost broke. "And that meant everything to me." Steve wiped both eyes slowly, but the tears kept coming. He wasn't trying to stop them anymore. "I was just trying to keep my own head above water," Steve said, voice shaking. "I had no idea I was keeping someone else afloat." "That's the mystery of grace," Keanu said. "It shows up when you least expect it, through people who don't even know they're being used for something holy." He leaned in slightly. "You didn't just speak into a room, Steve. You spoke into someone's silence." "Mine." Steve nodded again, slow, full of emotion. "And you didn't just remind me of faith. You reminded me that I mattered." Steve looked up at that. He held Keanu's gaze, and in that look was a mutual recognition. Two men who had been to the edge and returned, not whole, but honest. Keanu added quietly, "Sometimes we don't need a miracle. Sometimes we just need to know that someone sees us in the dark and doesn't look away." Steve's lips parted again, but the only thing that came out was a whisper of air. The tears on his face weren't from sadness anymore. They were from understanding. And the moment sat, fully formed, between them, sacred, untouchable, and true. Keanu took a breath and sat forward again. His posture wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't polished. He looked like a man about to hand someone a piece of their own heart, something precious that had been held in silence for far too long. "There's something you said," Keanu began, "in that video, a line I've never been able to forget." Steve lifted his eyes slowly. He looked at Keanu with the tired expression of someone who had just received more truth than they were ready for, but was still open to receiving more. Keanu held his gaze. His voice came quiet, calm, and deep. "Sometimes," he said, quoting it word for word, "you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing, and you don't even know it." He still broke. His face crumpled as the tears spilled freely, not in bursts but in waves. He brought his hand to his face, trying to catch them, trying to hold himself together. But it was no use. The dam had broken, not from pain, but from the overwhelming flood of recognition. That line, spoken years ago in vulnerability, now echoed back to him in the voice of someone he'd unknowingly helped save. The audience was silent, but their emotion was not. People wiped tears with sleeves, some clung to the hands of those beside them. A woman in the third row closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her lips. Even the crew members near the camera station stood still, some with heads bowed. Keanu didn't say anything else right away. He let Steve feel it, let him receive it. Then he added gently, "I needed to say those words back to you, Steve, because I think maybe you've forgotten how powerful they are." Steve let out a shaky breath, still covering the lower half of his face with one hand. His eyes were red, wet, shining with something that went deeper than grief. It was remembrance. It was a rediscovery of his own worth, spoken back to him by someone he never imagined he had reached. Keanu continued, his voice holding reverence. "I've carried that line with me for years. When I felt like I had nothing left to give. When I didn't know who I was outside of pain. When I questioned whether this world even needed me anymore. That line was a whisper in the dark." He looked down for a second, then up again. "I've stood in hotel rooms after press tours. I've walked out of award shows surrounded by cameras. I've sat in silence after phone calls that brought bad news. And in those moments, when the world looked at me and saw success, I heard your voice reminding me that just being here still had meaning." Steve lowered his hands, face wet but open now. He looked at Keanu with the kind of raw, soul-deep expression that no one rehearses. His shoulders had dropped. His breath had slowed, and his heart, clearly, was exposed. Steve finally managed to whisper, "I remember saying that, but I didn't think anyone was really listening." Keanu nodded, his eyes holding a quiet certainty. "We hear more than you think when we're in pain. Your voice didn't just speak to my ears, Steve. It spoke to something deeper. I wasn't ready to live again, but after hearing you, I was willing to try." The stillness in the studio wasn't just silence. It was sacred. A shared reverence filled the room. No one reached for a phone. No one dared interrupt. This wasn't a segment anymore. This wasn't entertainment. This was testimony. Steve let out a shaky breath. "I've sat in this chair for years, telling people to keep going, but I forget sometimes that it matters. I forget that it lands. You saying that, Keanu." He trailed off, voice quivering. Keanu leaned forward. "You helped me remember who I was beyond the grief, and I thought if you could believe in something greater, then maybe I could too." His hand motioned subtly toward Steve's crucifix. "Cross. You wear it like armor, and I used to think that meant you were invincible. But now I understand, faith isn't armor. It's a lifeline. And you offered yours without ever asking for thanks." Steve looked down at the cross on his chest, touched it, then closed his eyes. Keanu continued, "You didn't rescue me with a script, or a punchline, or a motivational catchphrase. You did it with honesty. You spoke to the man I didn't know how to be anymore." Someone in the audience let out a soft sob. It wasn't disruptive. It was a human response to a moment that stripped away every layer of performance and left only truth. Keanu's voice dropped lower. "You once said, 'Pain is a classroom, not a prison.' I carried that too, and when I didn't want to wake up the next morning, I told myself, maybe class wasn't over yet." Steve was weeping again, and this time, he didn't try to hide it. He nodded slowly, like each word was unlocking something that had been buried. Keanu smiled faintly. "You gave me back a piece of my humanity, Steve. Not as a host, not as a comedian, not even as a preacher, but as a man who was brave enough to speak light into darkness." The room seemed to exhale with him. Keanu looked around the studio, then turned back to Steve. "I know there are people watching this right now who feel lost, who think nobody sees them, who think their pain is too private, too ugly, too quiet to matter." He placed his hand over his heart. "I was one of them." Then he pointed gently, without theatrics, toward Steve. "But someone like you, just being honest, reminded me I wasn't invisible." Steve looked at him, speechless, eyes shimmering. Then, with a broken voice, he said, That's the greatest thing anyone's ever said to me. Keanu nodded slowly. It's the truth. And for a long moment the two men just sat there. No applause, no music, just presence. Just a memory being returned to its source. Keanu looked at Steve with a steady, respectful gaze. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a quiet revelation. You don't need a church, you don't need a robe, you don't even need a pulpit. Steve stared at him, unsure whether to speak or simply receive the words. The audience, still and breathless, leaned forward, drawn by something far beyond celebrity. It felt like something sacred was happening. Keanu went on, his voice gentle. Your pain is your ministry. Your comedy is the disguise God uses to heal people. Steve's eyes closed for a moment as if trying to process what had just been said. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. Keanu smiled faintly, but not out of amusement, out of recognition. You think you're just getting laughs, but you're handing out hope. One punchline at a time. One story at a time. That day, when I heard your voice in that video, you weren't trying to save anyone. You were just telling the truth. And that's exactly why it saved me. Steve tried to respond, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, then closed again. He finally looked down, then up at the studio lights, as if searching for the strength to remain composed. You're a minister, Steve, Keanu said softly. You just happened to wear a suit instead of a collar. The words echoed through the room like a bell rung in a quiet chapel. There was no applause, no whistles, no clapping. Just a few murmurs of emotion from the audience. Some wiped their eyes, others clasped their hands. A few simply bowed their heads. Steve finally whispered, No one's ever said that to me. Keanu nodded. Maybe no one else saw it, or maybe they were too distracted by the laughter. But I saw it, and I think, deep down, you've known it too. Steve blinked slowly. I always felt like there was something more, like I wasn't just supposed to make people laugh, but I didn't know what to call it. Call it what it is, Keanu said. It's a calling. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thick with meaning. Steve's shoulders rose as he drew in a deep breath, trying to settle the shaking inside. Keanu placed a hand lightly over his chest. And that thing you carry? That deep ache that you hide behind jokes? That's where your gift lives. It doesn't weaken your words. It gives them power. Steve's lips trembled, and he looked like he was holding something in, something heavy, long buried. Keanu added, You speak life into people who think they've run out of reasons to live. Not with sermons, not with scripture, but with honesty. Steve finally whispered, I've never thought of myself that way. Keanu replied, That's how I thought of you the moment I stood back up. That morning after I watched your video, I didn't feel inspired by a comedian. I felt guided by a man who knew what it was to bleed quietly and keep standing anyway. A sound broke in the audience. Someone sobbed quietly. Another sniffled. But no one spoke. No one moved. The studio had become a sanctuary. The host and the guest had vanished into something deeper. Two souls having church in front of millions. Oh, the man said, following procedure, turning toward the audience and the people. He took the table. Steve finally found his voice again, but it came out as a whisper. All these years, I thought I was just trying to make people forget their pain for a little while. I never thought I was helping them carry it. Keanu gave him a gentle nod. That's the difference. You're not distracting them. You're helping them survive it. Steve leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes glassy. I've lost people too, friends, family. I've had nights where I begged God just to take the weight off for 1 hour. Keanu didn't interrupt. He just listened, fully present, with quiet reverence. Steve continued, "But I didn't think what I was saying, what I was sharing, mattered to someone like you. You're a movie star. I'm just a guy trying to crack jokes in between commercial breaks." Keanu gently shook his head. "No, you're a man who reached into the dark and unknowingly pulled someone out." Steve looked up again. "Why me?" "Because you didn't pretend to have it all figured out," Keanu said. "You didn't try to be perfect. You were just honest. And sometimes, that's all someone needs. Not a preacher, not a hero, just a man with a scar who says, 'I've been where you are.'" Steve pressed a hand to his face. He wasn't crying in the way people expect on camera. It was quieter than that. Tears that came not from sadness, but from years of never knowing he had truly helped someone he admired. "You reminded me that I mattered," Keanu repeated, softer this time. "And I think the world needs to be reminded that you matter too, that what you're doing is ministry." Steve stared at his lap, his fingers loosely interlocked. "You know, I've done shows for decades. I've met presidents, kings, actors, athletes, but I've never sat across from someone and felt seen like this." Keanu gave a half smile. "That's what happens when pain meets purpose." A few audience members nodded, visibly moved. There was no forced laughter, no jokes to reset the moment, just the shared understanding that something meaningful had happened in the room, and that it had nothing to do with celebrity. "You ever think," Steve said slowly, "that maybe the reason you were pulled through all that pain was so you could say this exact thing right now?" Keanu let the question hang. Then he nodded. "I do." Steve nodded back. "Me too." Then, with a shaky voice, he added, "I always wanted my work to mean something. I just never knew it already did." Keanu leaned in just slightly. "It always did." The stillness lingered. Not empty silence, but full, resonant quiet. A moment without punchlines or applause. Just truth sitting in the air between two men who had lived through different storms, but somehow ended up on the same sacred ground. Steve swallowed hard. "I think I needed to hear that more than I realized." Keanu looked down briefly, then back up. "We all need reminding sometimes, even the ones doing the reminding." Steve looked down at the crucifix on his chest, the same one Keanu had mentioned just moments earlier. His fingers touched it gently, almost like checking if it was still real. Then he let out a soft breath and shook his head. "Why me, man?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Out of everybody God could have picked, why me?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He let the question breathe, as if giving it room to find its own truth. Then, with a quiet steadiness that filled the space like a tide, he replied, "Because he chooses the broken ones." Steve looked up, eyes searching. "The ones who know what it means to bleed quietly," Keanu continued. "The ones who've been through fire and didn't come out untouched, but still chose to keep walking." Steve swallowed hard. The words didn't just sound poetic, they sounded familiar. Like they'd been hiding somewhere inside him all along, waiting to be spoken by someone who'd lived it too. "But I didn't go to seminary," Steve said, voice cracking. "I didn't train for this. I don't have a title or a degree or whatever ministers are supposed to have." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Exactly. That's why people believe you." Steve blinked. "You're not preaching," Keanu said softly. "You're surviving. You're not delivering sermons from behind a pulpit. You're telling the truth from a place people recognize. Pain, recovery, faith without perfection. That's what makes you real." Steve shook his head again, still trying to process it. "I don't feel qualified, man." Keanu nodded slowly. "None of us do. That's the point." For a moment, Steve's eyes drifted toward the audience, but he didn't really see them. His gaze was far away, somewhere in a memory. "There were nights," he whispered, where I laid in bed and asked God if I was just talking to myself. If these jokes I was telling, or these stories I shared, even made a dent in someone's life. "Take me down," Keanu said. They made a dent in mine. Steve's eyes watered again. He bit his lip, trying to hold it in, but it was no use. "I'm not used to hearing that." Keanu sat still. "That's why you needed to." Steve let out a long exhale, almost like a release of years of uncertainty. I thought maybe I was too messy, too flawed." "We all are," Keanu said, "but that's what makes us useful." The room had grown still again. Even the audience members who were silently crying didn't dare shift in their seats. Something sacred was unfolding. Not scripted, not produced. Just raw truth between two men with nothing left to perform for. Steve wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You think God really uses people like me?" Keanu nodded. "He always has." "But I cuss," Steve said, trying to laugh through his tears. "I mess up, I doubt, I fall short." Keanu smiled gently. So did Peter. So did David. So did just about everyone God ever called. That hit Steve hard. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, breathing slowly, as if trying to steady something deep inside him that had been shaken loose. "You're not the exception, Steve," Keanu said, voice low. "You're the example." Steve leaned back slightly, visibly overwhelmed. The idea of being the example didn't sit comfortably with him. He'd spent a lifetime cracking jokes, dodging praise, and staying just vulnerable enough to connect, but never enough to be exposed. And now, here was Keanu, peeling back every layer with gentleness and clarity, not to glorify him, but to remind him of something he had long buried. "I used to think," Steve said after a pause, "that if I kept people laughing, they wouldn't look too hard at what I was hiding." Keanu's expression didn't change. He just listened. "And you know what?" Steve continued. "That worked, for a long time. The pain stayed behind the curtain, the crowd stayed entertained. But at night, man, at night it got quiet. And that silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud." Keanu nodded. "I know that silence." Steve looked at him. "You really do, don't you?" Keanu didn't answer with words, just a slight nod. The kind of nod that didn't come from agreement, but from experience. Steve's voice lowered. "That's why this hit's different. You're not flattering me." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That what you carry isn't a burden. It's a message. A living message. That you can go through pain and still smile. Still stand. Still show up for others, even when you're bleeding inside." Steve let out a shaky breath. "I never thought of myself like that." "That's the humility talking," Keanu said. "That's why it's real." There was a long pause. Steve's eyes glistened again, but this time it wasn't from shame or doubt. It was something else. Recognition. For perhaps the first time, he was seeing his life not as a series of stumbles and setbacks, but as a trail of sacred moments, hidden ministries, laughs that bandaged wounds, stories that planted seeds, words that saved a life. Keanu spoke again, quieter now. "You didn't know it then, but every time you told someone they weren't alone, you were doing holy work." Steve looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. "Nobody's ever said that to me." Keanu smiled gently. "Maybe they didn't know how. Maybe they were too busy laughing to realize what you'd just given them." The room stayed hushed, caught between silence and breath. Then Steve said something soft. "I guess I always thought I had to be more, I don't know, put together, more polished. If I was going to matter, but that's not what changes people," Keanu said. "It's not the polish, it's the cracks. That's where the light gets through." Steve looked at him again, eyes wide with emotion. You quoting Leonard Cohen on me now? Keanu chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just living it. They both smiled. It was the kind of smile born from shared pain, shared survival, and shared faith. Not a religion, something deeper. A trust that even in their brokenness, they had purpose. That even without titles or robes, their lives were being used to heal others. Steve looked down again, shaking his head slowly. Man, I don't know what this is, but I feel it. Deep. Keanu nodded. That's how you know it's real. Steve sat still, the weight of everything finally landing in his chest. The lights of the studio seemed softer now, the air thicker, like the moment itself demanded reverence. He turned to Keanu, his voice low but steady. Do you really believe we can have faith in a world like this? Keanu didn't rush his answer. He took a breath and let the silence fill in first, as if the question deserved to be respected before it was answered. Then, calmly and clearly, he said, yes, because faith is the only thing that isn't pretending. Steve blinked, caught off guard by the sharpness of that answer. Keanu continued, everything around us can be edited. On screen, we get second takes. Online, we crop out the mess. In interviews, we rehearse our vulnerability until it sounds inspiring. But faith? It doesn't come dressed up. It doesn't ask for lighting or filters. He turned slightly toward Steve. Faith met me when I had nothing to perform. When I was at my rawest, my weakest, my quietest. Steve's eyes narrowed, not in skepticism, but in contemplation. Keanu added, that's why I trust it. Because it didn't show up when I was strong or successful. It showed up when I was empty. And it didn't try to fix me with a slogan or a script. It just sat beside me in the dark. Steve let out a quiet breath. Man. Keanu leaned forward, his tone more intense now but never forced. You want to know what made me start believing again? It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a miracle. It was your voice. That night, that moment, it wasn't even about what you said. It was how you said it. Steve looked confused. How I said it? You weren't trying to be right, you were just being real. You said, storms don't come to destroy you, they come to clear the path. And I remember thinking, he's not preaching, he's bleeding truth. Steve looked away for a moment, the memory tugging at something deeper. I've lived in a world, Keanu continued, where so many things are fake. Fame is curated. Stories are rewritten. People smile while hiding knives. But when you spoke that night, I felt no performance, just presence, just pain turned into power. Steve cleared his throat and whispered, I don't even remember recording that video. Keanu smiled gently. That's the thing about truth. You don't always know when you're speaking it, but the person who needs it, they remember every word. Steve pressed his hand to the crucifix around his neck again. Keanu noticed the motion and nodded toward it. That symbol you wear? It's not just decoration. It's weight. And sometimes, I think God lets certain people carry it quietly, through comedy, through kindness, through being there when nobody else is. Steve shook his head, humbled. I ain't no pastor, man. You didn't have to be, Keanu replied. You were human. And that was enough. The silence between them grew sacred again, full of invisible threads of connection. Pain, faith, gratitude, and something deeper than all of it. Something eternal. Steve finally said, so in the middle of all this chaos, you really think faith holds up? Keanu nodded without hesitation. Faith is the only thing that still tells the truth. Steve leaned back slightly, staring at the floor like it held answers. I used to think faith was something you had to work toward, like a prize. A perfect score. Keanu nodded gently. Me too. I thought you had to earn it. Be clean, polished, whole. But then life broke me open. And I realized faith isn't for the people who have it all figured out. It's for the ones who have nothing left to lean on but grace. Steve's throat tightened. Sometimes I still feel like a fraud. Keanu turned to him, eyes calm but unwavering. Then, you're exactly who grace is for. There was no audience laughter, no applause. Just silence, sacred and thick. Even the cameras felt like they were holding their breath. Keanu went on. You ask me if we can have faith in a world like this. Look around. We live in a world where kids lose their parents too young, where people scroll through highlight reels while drowning in private pain, where strangers carry silent griefs you'll never know. He paused for just a second. But I believe faith is what helps us see beyond the chaos. It's what whispers, "You're not alone." It's what carried me through nights I didn't want to wake up from. Steve swallowed hard. But how do you hold on to it when life keeps hitting? You don't, Keanu said softly. Sometimes you don't hold it. Sometimes it holds you. Steve's lips parted. He wasn't expecting that. Keanu continued. There were nights I didn't pray, didn't hope, didn't even speak, but I think faith stayed anyway. Quiet, patient, sitting in the corner, waiting for me to breathe again. Steve finally looked him in the eye. You're not what I expected. Keanu chuckled quietly. Most people don't expect much from actors. No, Steve said. I mean, I thought you were wise, but not like this. This is different. Keanu shrugged humbly. I think pain teaches you things nothing else can. Not awards, not wealth, not praise. Pain doesn't flatter, it chisels. Steve's eyes softened. It chisels you into what? Keanu looked directly at him, into someone who knows how to listen. There was a pause, long and meaningful. Steve whispered, You really think faith is the only thing that's not pretending? Keanu's voice barely rose above a breath. I know it is. Steve smiled, eyes glossy but heart settling. I've said a lot of things in my life, man, but I don't think I've ever sat still long enough to hear the echo of them come back like this. Keanu's tone turned reflective. That's because truth echoes. Even when we forget, we spoke it. Steve leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You think God really uses broken people? Keanu's reply was simple. They're the only kind. He's God. Steve laughed softly through his tears. It wasn't a full laugh. It was a cracked laugh, a knowing one, forged through too many quiet nights and too many heavy mornings. Keanu nodded. You weren't just a voice on my phone. You were a whisper of grace. And I don't think you even knew it. Steve's hands trembled slightly. I do now. Keanu stood up slowly, his movements unhurried, almost reverent. Steve instinctively rose with him, as if something sacred was happening, something that didn't belong to the show, the cameras, or even the moment. It belonged to something greater. Keanu faced Steve directly, and his voice came low but firm. You thought you were telling jokes, but you were saving lives. Steve blinked, stunned. Man, you saved mine, Keanu added. That video, that voice, that fire behind your words, it cut through the silence I was living in. I didn't even know I was waiting to be found, but you found me, and you weren't even trying. Steve's shoulders slumped slightly, not in shame, but in a strange release, like someone had just taken a weight off his back that he didn't realize he'd been carrying. I've thought about quitting, Steve said, almost inaudibly, more times than I can count. I thought maybe I'd said everything I had to say, that I'd done all I could do. Some nights, I looked at myself in the mirror and wondered if I had anything left that mattered. Keanu didn't hesitate. So have I. But maybe God kept us both here for this. Steve's breath caught. There was no applause, no music, just quiet. Keanu stepped forward slightly, just enough to close the gap between them. Maybe the very thing you thought was just a gig, just entertainment, was the very thing someone else was clinging to like a rope. Steve stared at him, speechless. "I don't know how it works," Keanu admitted. "I'm not a preacher, I've got no credentials, but I know what it's like to be drowning and see someone laughing on the shore. Except their laughter doesn't mock you, it gives you hope." Steve swallowed the lump in his throat. "I thought about walking away last year. I didn't tell anyone. I just felt like maybe I had run my course. I wasn't sure I was helping anybody anymore." Keanu's eyes didn't move. "But you were. You were helping people you'll never meet. Saving people you didn't even know were watching." Steve looked down at his shoes, unable to speak. Keanu continued, "The thing about pain is, it either isolates you or it becomes a bridge. You chose the bridge. You didn't even know you were building it, but you were." Steve whispered, "I just wanted to make people laugh." "And you did," Keanu said. "But you also did something more. You made people feel seen. You made people feel like they weren't crazy for hurting." There was a long pause. Steve was trembling slightly. Keanu added gently, "There's a reason your voice carried. It wasn't just timing or talent or production. It was something deeper, something holy." Steve looked up, eyes moist. "I don't know what to do with all this, man." "You don't have to do anything," Keanu replied. "Just receive it." Steve laughed, but it cracked in his throat. "Nobody ever says that. It's always, fix this, solve that, get back out there. Nobody ever says, receive it." Keanu nodded. "Then let me be the first." They stood there, two men from different worlds, connected by invisible scars and unseen grace. Keanu's voice dropped again. "God doesn't always show up in churches. Sometimes he shows up in a studio, in the middle of a taping, between two men who thought they were out of answers." Steve smiled, tears finally falling freely. "And sometimes he wears a black suit and has a quiet voice." Keanu smiled softly back. "And sometimes he hides in a joke." Steve looked at the floor, then back up at Keanu, visibly struggling to find the words. "I used to think the laughs were enough," he said. "Like, if I could get a crowd to smile, I'd done my job. But somewhere along the way, I started to wonder if I was just distracting people from their pain instead of helping them walk through it." Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "You weren't distracting us, you were lighting the path." Steve gave a quiet chuckle, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Man, nobody's ever said that to me before." "Well," Keanu said gently, "maybe nobody knew how much you needed to hear it." Silence fell again, not awkward but reverent. The crew members had stopped moving. The cameras kept rolling, but no one cared about angles anymore. It felt like they were all witnessing something sacred. Keanu took another breath. "I didn't know how to describe what I was going through back then. I didn't have the vocabulary for it. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even numb. I was erased." Steve's face crumpled again at that word. "I remember sitting on my bed, phone in hand, not even knowing what I was looking for, just scrolling, like maybe if I stared long enough, something would change, something would grab me." Steve asked quietly. "And then you found the clip." Keanu nodded. "I don't know what made me click it. Maybe it was divine, maybe it was random, but I watched you in that moment, pacing on that little stage, and you said something that felt like it was meant just for me." Steve waited, eyes locked in. "You said, sometimes you're not the one being rescued, you're the one doing the rescuing and you don't even know it." Steve closed his eyes, those words washing over him now with a different weight. "I remember thinking, what if that's true? What if I'm not useless? What if I'm just in the middle of something I can't see yet?" Keanu whispered. Steve's hand went to his chest again, gripping the crucifix beneath his shirt. "I forgot I even said that." "You may have," Keanu said, "but I didn't. It stuck to me. It pulled me through a season where I didn't want to speak, didn't want to eat, didn't want to be seen. But that sentence made me feel assigned. Like maybe I was still here for a reason." Steve wiped his face again, shaking his head slowly. "I don't even know what to say to that." "You don't need to," Keanu replied. "Just know it mattered. Know it was enough." The room remained still, like time had paused for a reason, and maybe it had. Steve eventually found his voice again. "You know, I thought God was done with me. I thought I'd used up my good years, that I'd had my moment in the sun and it was over." Keanu responded with something that carried both gravity and grace. "God doesn't measure worth by years. He measures it by what you give away. And you, Steve, whether you knew it or not, gave away life. To me, and probably to thousands of others." Steve's hands dropped to his sides, his posture softening. "I just wanted to make a difference." "You did," Keanu said. "You still are." They stood there, the two of them, surrounded by quiet weeping, not out of sadness, but healing. This was no longer a show. It was no longer entertainment. It had become testimony. Keanu didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just opened his arms, slow and steady, like he was offering something sacred. Not a handshake, not a pat on the back, but something that transcended all of it. Steve looked at him for a beat, heart pounding in his chest, and then stepped forward into the embrace. The hug was quiet, strong, and long. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for the audience. It was for something deeper than both of them. Their arms wrapped around each other like they'd been carrying weight neither had words for, and finally they were setting it down in each other's presence. Two men, broken in different ways but healed in the same breath. There were no tears now, just stillness, a sacred quiet that pulsed louder than applause. The room changed. One by one, the audience began to rise to their feet, not clapping, not cheering, just standing, as if honoring something holy, as if bearing witness to something they couldn't explain but knew was real. Some held hands over their hearts, others just bowed their heads. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. A moment later, Keanu slowly pulled back, still holding Steve's shoulders, and looked into his eyes. Steve's face was red and wet, but his eyes were shining. Keanu didn't say a word. He just nodded once, slowly, like a blessing being given without a sermon. Steve took a shaky breath and said quietly, "I've had a lot of moments on this stage, man. Interviews, standing ovations, big guests. But this..." He glanced around at the silent room, at the crew frozen behind cameras, at the audience on their feet with tears in their eyes. "This is the greatest gift." Keanu smiled softly, his eyes still glistening. Maybe it wasn't even meant to be an interview. Steve laughed through his tears. "No, it wasn't. It was a reunion," Keanu said. Steve nodded slowly. "Yeah, of two people who didn't know they were connected by something bigger than both of us." Keanu whispered, "Grace." That word lingered in the air like incense. No one repeated it, but it settled on the hearts of every person in that room. Steve looked down and touched the crucifix around his neck. "I used to think I wore this for protection, but maybe I wear it to remember." "To remember what?" Keanu asked gently. Steve looked up, tears trembling again. "That even when I felt like nobody was listening, somebody was." Keanu stepped beside him now, shoulder to shoulder. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't have to. The air itself had shifted. It was no longer a television studio. It felt like a chapel. The audience remained on their feet, as if instinctively knowing this was not the kind of moment you sit through. Some hugged the person next to them. Some held their breath. The stillness was powerful, not awkward, not empty. Holy sh... Even the cameras didn't zoom in. No dramatic music played. The silence was the soundtrack. And somehow, it said more than 1,000 words ever could. Finally, Steve cleared his throat, still hoarse. I don't know what this means for me moving forward, but I know I can't go back to pretending. Keanu looked at him, his voice low. You don't have to. Steve stood there, looking out over the quiet audience. His hands were trembling slightly, but he didn't try to hide it. For once, the man known for timing punchlines didn't reach for a joke. He reached for truth. I've spent most of my career trying to make people laugh, he said softly. And don't get me wrong, laughter heals. I believe that, with everything in me. He paused, his voice catching. But sometimes, I wondered if it was enough. Keanu stayed beside him, silent support in human form. I'd go home, after shows, after good nights, standing ovations, Emmy wins, and I'd sit in the quiet, wondering if what I said really mattered. Steve looked down. Then I'd replay something I said on stage, and it just felt small. He looked up again. But you, Keanu, you just told me I saved your life with something I don't even remember saying. Keanu nodded. Because you didn't try to be powerful. You were just honest, and that's what makes people listen. That's what made me listen. Steve wiped his face, trying to keep composure, but the vulnerability was spilling out now. I almost quit, man. A few years back, I told my wife I was done. I said, I've run out of things to say. He shook his head slowly. But God, he knew better. He didn't need me to say something new. He just needed me to say what I already lived. Keanu's voice was calm. That's why it mattered, because it came from scars, not scripts. Steve turned toward him again. How did you know to come here today, to say all this? I didn't, Keanu said. I just felt drawn. Like maybe the thing I needed years ago, you might need now. Steve's eyes softened. You're telling me I needed to hear my own words? Keanu looked around the room. Sometimes the healer needs healing, and sometimes God sends it back through the very people you unknowingly rescued. Steve stared at him for a long moment. Then, almost involuntarily, he stepped forward and hugged Keanu again. This time, shorter, but just as powerful. From the audience, a quiet sob was heard. Keanu and Steve both turned toward the crowd. An elderly woman near the front clutched a tissue, her hands shaking. You saved me too, Steve, she whispered. More heads nodded in the crowd. A man in a military uniform murmured, That video you did about pain, I watched it every day in the hospital. Another voice, from the shadows of the audience, said through tears, I didn't take the pills that night. Because of you. Steve's face broke. He put a hand over his mouth, overwhelmed. I didn't know, he choked out. Keanu whispered, Now you do. Keanu stood quietly, letting the weight of the moment settle into the room like dew on grass. The silence wasn't empty. It was sacred. Every face in the audience held still, as if afraid even a breath might break the holiness that had taken over. Then Keanu spoke, voice low but filled with calm strength. There's a sentence I've heard you say before, Steve, he began. You said it once, not knowing anyone would really remember. Steve's head tilted slightly, his eyes curious, his face still wet with tears. Keanu continued word for word, letting each syllable fall gently. God doesn't always call the qualified, he qualifies the called. The room didn't move. Steve's eyes widened. The breath he took was shaky, the kind a man takes when his soul is being stitched back together without anesthesia. Keanu's voice didn't rush. You didn't need to be a preacher in a pulpit, you didn't need a ministry degree, you just needed to live your life with truth, and that became your sermon. Steve's lip trembled. He blinked hard, as if trying to hold back another flood. "Sometimes," Keanu said, "your pain becomes your platform." Steve let out a slow exhale. That's what I said years ago. I remember now. That was after I lost my brother." Keanu nodded, soft but steady. "I know. That clip of you telling that story, that's the one that reached me." Steve swallowed. "I said it, but I forgot it. I forgot my own words." "That's what happens," Keanu replied. "You give so much away that you forget to keep any for yourself." Steve nodded slowly, the revelation hitting like a wave returning to shore after years lost at sea. "I thought if I wasn't on stage or telling jokes, I didn't matter," Steve said quietly. "Like, if people weren't laughing, maybe I was just taking up space." Keanu stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Steve's shoulder. "You matter, Steve," he said. "Not for what you do, not for how many laughs you pull from a crowd, not for your timing or your stories or your talent." Steve looked up into his eyes. "You matter for who you are." Steve's mouth opened, then closed again. He couldn't speak. All he could do was cry. Keanu gave him a moment, then added, "God doesn't keep score the way people do. He doesn't grade you on applause or how perfectly the set lands. He looks at the quiet things, the moments nobody sees." He paused, letting Steve absorb it. "The nights you stayed up to call a friend, the prayers you whispered when no one was around, the way you still showed up even when your heart was shattered." Steve's shoulders shook again. He looked down and covered his face, not from shame, but from overwhelming truth. "You matter," Keanu repeated gently. "You've always mattered. Your life has echoed louder than you know." From somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "Amen." Keanu waited while Steve gathered himself, hands still covering his face, the kind of tears that don't come from pain alone, but from years of pushing it down. This wasn't sorrow anymore. This was release. When Steve finally looked up, his voice was hoarse. "I forgot how much that sentence meant," he whispered. "I forgot it came from my own mouth." Keanu nodded. "That's why I had to remind you, because sometimes the healer needs healing too." Steve wiped his face with the back of his hand. "It's just, people think I'm strong. They think because I smile, I'm fine. Because I laugh, I'm okay. That's the lie we all learn to carry," Keanu said gently. "But pain doesn't go away just because we entertain others. In fact, sometimes the ones who make the world laugh are the ones who cry the most in private." Steve's eyes drifted to the ceiling, his voice soft. "There were nights I'd walk off stage and sit in the dressing room, alone. And I'd ask God, what am I even doing here? Is any of this really helping anyone?" "It helped me," Keanu said. "You helped me." Steve's mouth quivered. "I was in one of those seasons where everything in life felt like static, like I was walking through fog. Fame was loud, but my soul was quiet. Numb." He looked directly at Steve. "And I remember scrolling one night, not looking for anything in particular, and there it was, you, on that couch, saying, 'Sometimes your pain becomes your platform.'" Steve closed his eyes as Keanu continued. "You weren't yelling. You weren't even being funny. You were just honest." Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. And in that moment, it felt like God wasn't far away anymore. Steve sat still, absorbing every word like water on dry land. "You gave me permission to feel again," Keanu said. "To believe that being broken wasn't a failure. It was a doorway." Steve slowly nodded. "It's strange, man. I've been on this stage for years, and I've talked to presidents, to preachers, to celebrities, but none of them ever said that to me." Keanu smiled faintly. "Sometimes God doesn't need an audience. Sometimes he just needs one man to remind another that he's still seen." The quiet in the room deepened, as if the air itself was listening. Steve exhaled. "I don't know how, to thank you. You already have, Keanu said. By surviving, by not quitting, by telling the truth when it was easier to smile and lie. Steve looked down at his hands, then back up again. Do you really think my pain has a purpose? I know it does, Keanu replied, because your pain has healed more people than your comedy ever could. That statement hit like a chord strummed deep in Steve's chest. His hand instinctively touched the crucifix around his neck, a motion so subtle and automatic it was like muscle memory. Keanu noticed. That cross, it's not just a symbol, it's a reminder that even God didn't escape suffering. Steve whispered, so you're saying suffering isn't failure? It's the beginning of ministry, Keanu said. The truest kind. The kind that doesn't speak from a stage, but from a scar. Steve's head dropped again. He wasn't crying this time. He was breathing. Deep, settled, healing breaths. Keanu waited a moment, then placed both hands on Steve's shoulders. You don't need to become anyone else, Steve. You don't need to try harder. You don't need to prove anything. He leaned in closer. You just need to remember, you were already enough. Keanu's eyes moved gently to the crucifix hanging from Steve's chest. The small piece of metal caught a faint glimmer of light from above, like it had been waiting for this moment to be noticed. That cross, Keanu said softly. It's not just a symbol. Steve blinked, the weight of the evening catching up to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Keanu continued, voice steady and low. It's a signal. A divine signal. And tonight I think it's pointing to something greater than both of us. Steve looked down at it, fingers unconsciously lifting the chain like it had suddenly grown heavier. He whispered, Why me? There was no tremor in Keanu's voice when he answered, just clarity. Because God trusts you with the microphone. Steve froze. The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It was reverent, sacred. Even the cameras seemed to fade from awareness as the weight of those words filled the space between them. Keanu didn't move, didn't blink. He could have chosen anyone, Steve, a scholar, a preacher, someone with credentials. But he chose you, because there's something about your voice, your presence, that reaches people in places no sermon can go. Steve swallowed hard, his hand still cradling the cross, like it was the only anchor keeping him steady. But I've messed up so many times, he said. Keanu nodded. Exactly. That's why it works. People don't need perfection. They need permission to be human. And when they see you, honest, flawed, broken, but still standing, they believe there's hope for them too. Steve leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, his frame smaller than it had ever looked on that stage. I never thought I'd be worthy. That's the trap, Keanu said. We think we have to earn it, deserve it. But God doesn't operate on our merit. He looks at availability, not resumes. Steve closed his eyes again. Think about it, Keanu added. All those nights you thought your words were just jokes, but people were driving home with tears in their eyes. Not from laughter, from healing. Steve opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no words ready to come out. Keanu gently pressed on. You were giving people something they didn't know they needed. Permission to laugh while they limped. A reason to breathe through the pain. Steve's voice was faint when he spoke. You really believe all that? I do, Keanu said, because I was one of them. There was something final in the way Keanu said it, not as a guest, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had been on the receiving end of a lifeline he didn't know he needed. Steve looked at the cross again, but this time with new eyes, not as a decoration, not even as a token of belief, but as a baton, a quiet passing of purpose. You think God's really using me like that? Keanu nodded slowly. I don't think. I know. Steve chuckled faintly, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief and awe tangled together. Man, If you told me this morning I'd be having this conversation on national television, I would have laughed you off the stage." Keanu smiled. "Sometimes God hijacks the script." Steve's laughter faded, replaced with a solemn peace settling over his features. Keanu leaned forward. "That cross isn't just telling people what you believe, it's showing them who you are." Steve looked at Keanu, eyes wide, like something had just clicked deep inside him. "So, it's not about being perfect?" Keanu shook his head gently. "It's about being present. When someone's hurting, they don't need a lecture. They need someone who's been through the fire and still walks toward them." Steve took a long breath. "All these years, I thought the pain was the punishment." Keanu leaned closer. "It was the preparation." Steve froze. "The nights you cried yourself to sleep, the times you bombed on stage and wanted to quit, the shame you carried in private while making the world laugh in public. All of it, it wasn't a waste. It was the furnace that forged the voice people trust." Steve stared down at the floor, his shoulders trembling. Keanu didn't rush him. He let the silence work, like medicine. "Steve," he said finally, "you weren't given the microphone to entertain. You were given it to reach people others couldn't, the ones sitting in the dark, the ones no pastor could ever touch." Steve slowly raised his head, his expression no longer confused, just overwhelmed. "And you think the cross is, what, a reminder?" Keanu nodded. "A reminder, yes, but more than that, it's a calling card. When you wear that, you're not just showing faith, you're stepping into purpose." Steve blinked hard. "I never saw it like that. I thought it was just something I wore after my dad passed. He used to tell me it would protect me." Keanu smiled. "And maybe it did. But maybe tonight, it's not protecting you. Maybe it's pointing you." Steve's lips parted like he was about to speak, but the words stalled. Keanu continued, softer now. "You said earlier, why me? And the answer is still the same. Because you're willing. God can do a lot with a willing heart, even a cracked one." Steve gave a small nod, and for a moment, it felt like something shifted in the air, like the room itself had inhaled. "I've never had anyone say something like this to me," Steve whispered. Keanu nodded. Maybe no one had the words. Maybe they were waiting for the moment to be this quiet, this holy. Steve looked toward the audience, many of whom had tears running down their cheeks. "You see that?" Keanu asked. "They're not clapping. They're not cheering. They're breathing you in. Because they see you now. Not as a celebrity, but as a vessel." Steve exhaled slowly, like he had been holding that breath for years. "I don't know what to do with all this." Keanu's voice was calm. "You don't have to do anything. Just be. Let God do the rest." Steve chuckled gently, the tension in his shoulders loosening. "That's hard for a guy who's used to writing every punchline." "Maybe now," Keanu said, "you'll start writing something deeper, a kind of truth only you can deliver." Steve looked back at the cross. This time, he didn't just hold it, he pressed it lightly against his heart. And for the first time all night, he didn't ask why. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu sat in stillness beside him, a man who'd once found hope in a stranger's joke, now returning that hope in sacred words. The studio remained silent, not from awkwardness, but reverence, because something holy had happened, and everyone in the room knew it. The screen fades gently from the studio lights to a quiet montage. There's no fanfare, no applause, just a slow, reverent progression of moments. The grainy footage of Steve's earliest shows plays first. Him pacing a small stage in Cleveland, cracking jokes to a crowd that didn't know his name yet. Then a clip of him hosting Family Feud, face lit up with laughter, lifting the mood in millions of living rooms across America. Over these images, Keanu's voice begins, soft and reflective. Sometimes the loudest sermon doesn't come from a pulpit. Sometimes it's disguised in laughter, hidden in pain, or whispered through a broken heart. The footage shifts. Keanu is shown behind the scenes of that same interview. He's not in character. He's not posing. He's listening. Steve is speaking off camera. The exchange isn't dramatic. It's sacred. Years ago, I heard a man say something that stopped me cold. He said, "God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called." I never forgot that. More clips follow. Kind moments caught in passing. Keanu helping a stagehand pick up papers dropped in a rush. Steve consoling a young guest during a break in taping. Neither act was televised. But now they're seen, because the message of this story isn't about celebrity. It's about calling. Keanu continues, "Faith isn't about shouting it loudest. It's about living it quietly, showing up even when you're empty, loving even when you're hurting, believing even when the world calls you a fool." The footage changes again. A still shot of Steve's face from the taping. Tears in his eyes, his hand gripping the crucifix around his neck. The studio audience is standing, but no one is cheering. They're simply watching, bearing witness to something that wasn't planned, something that didn't fit the format. Steve thought he was just making people laugh, but what he didn't know, Keanu's voice softens, was that he was keeping people alive, including me. Now, images from that day play in slow motion. Keanu placing a hand on Steve's shoulder, Steve lowering his head, and then the hug. That long, silent embrace that changed the temperature of the entire room. "You saved me," Keanu says, quietly. There's no music, no build-up, just silence. Then, Keanu adds, "Now let that message save others." The screen darkens for a moment. Then it returns with a question, plain white letters on black. Have you ever been lifted by someone's unexpected words? A pause. Share your story in the comments. You never know who needs to read it. Then Keanu's voice returns, one last time. If you believe in the power of faith through pain, if you've ever felt rescued by kindness or strengthened by someone who didn't even know they were helping you, then hit subscribe. This channel is for you. Not just for watchers. It's for the wounded, the wondering, the waiting. It's for people like us. The screen slowly returns from black, revealing a final image. Steve sitting in his dressing room after the show, still wearing his suit, his crucifix now resting over his heart instead of hidden beneath his shirt. The camera doesn't intrude. It simply watches as he stares at his reflection in silence. Keanu's voice returns, not booming, not cinematic, just real. There's a moment after the lights go off, after the audience leaves, when the world stops performing. Some people run from that silence, but for others, that's where God speaks. The image transitions to a simple shot of Steve closing his eyes. He isn't performing now. He isn't being funny. He's just breathing. One hand lifts to his heart. It stays there. Then an older clip appears, almost forgotten, a grainy video from the early 2000s-esque Steve on stage during a stand-up set, half joking, half preaching, not yet famous. His words echo out over the present-day silence. I believe the hardest people to save are the ones still trying to save everyone else. Keanu's voice overlaps gently, and maybe that's why God chooses them. As the montage continues, the audience sees flashes of the people Steve helped across the years. A veteran who once thanked him for being the only reason he laughed during chemotherapy. A young comic who credits Steve's mentorship for saving his life. A tearful woman from the audience hugging Steve after he spoke about depression and loss. All real, all unpublicized. Then the camera finds Keanu, alone in a simple room. He's not dressed for a role. He's wearing a plain black t-shirt. His hands are folded, his eyes down. His voice returns, this time more personal. I didn't come on that show to promote a movie. I didn't walk into that studio as a celebrity. I walked in because I had something I needed to give back to a man who had no idea he once rescued me when I was drowning. More images, this time from Steve's side. Him walking through hospital corridors during one of his charity visits. Him quietly handing an envelope to a single mother backstage. No cameras, no attention. Just a man doing what he felt called to do. Keanu continues, "Pain doesn't cancel your purpose, it clarifies it." And Steve's purpose wasn't to tell jokes, it was to tell the truth. In the only language some hurting people could understand. A new image now. A Bible on Steve's nightstand, worn, dog-eared, marked with small scribbles. The same Bible that had been passed down from his grandfather, the one he never talked about on air. A Bible opened to a single underlined verse. Heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. And Keanu's voice. Some people hold microphones. Some people hold Bibles. But the ones who hold both, they carry something this world desperately needs. The screen begins fading to black. A final whisper from Keanu, tender and slow. You don't need a title to be a vessel. You don't need applause to be a healer. You just need to keep showing up. Because someone out there is still listening. It's someone like I was. A still frame lingers. Steve and Keanu seated side by side on stage. No script between them. No cameras rolling. Just two men. One wounded, one grateful. The bond now sacred. The room quiet. The mission clear. Then, white text fades in across the screen. You matter, you always have. A final pause. Then Keanu's closing whisper. You saved me. Now let that message save others. You call to action. Have you ever been lifted by someone's unexpected words? Share your story in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs today. And if you believe in the power of faith through pain, hit subscribe. This channel is for you. For the quiet warriors, the unexpected healers, and the ones still waiting for a sign. This was their sign.